Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Wednesday, the 3rd of January, 2024. Today is the 123rd anniversary of the birth of Erich Hermann Wilhelm Vögelin, who was born in Cologne on this date in 1901. Voegelin was a prolific writer. His collected works are 34 volumes. 5 volumes of that is his series Order and History. 8 volumes of that is the posthumously published History of Political Ideas. There are multiple centers of Voegelin research at several universities. I know of at least one website devoted to his point of view, the Voegelin View website. And I have run at least across at least a couple of people who have called him the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. So even if his name recognition is not that great, he does have, there is a lot of active research centered on his work. But he is difficult to read and difficult to understand at times. His posthumously published essay, What is History, from approximately 1963, is in volume 28 of the collected works. And it is a typically difficult piece. And I'm going to read a little bit from it because it illustrates some interesting points of his perspective. And especially the first sentence, quote, "An inquiry concerning history has predecessors but no traditions," unquote. That, I think, is a very important point that is not often enough noted, and that is true of almost every under-theorized body of knowledge. You have predecessors, but there's no tradition. In science, we would say, after Lakatos, there's no scientific research program, but there are people who came before you and discussed it. So Voegelin is saying that history is under-theorized, essentially, because you have predecessors, but there's no real tradition in any theoretical history tradition that you can contribute to, because there's no real tradition. There's just predecessors, and you pick and choose what you want from that, try to do the best you can, but there's no tradition to work in. So continuing on, quote, "The reason, well known, if not too well understood, is the elusive character of history as an object in the sense in which we speak of things or objects in the external world. In contemporary epistemology and methodology, the various difficulties arising from this source are much discussed. The debate, however, is wanting in theoretical incisiveness, inasmuch as the difference between our knowledge of the external world and our knowledge and an experience involving transcendence is not brought to sufficient clarity. Hence, I shall not join the debate, but rather summarize the difficulties by means of 3 propositions constructed in such a manner that they will recall certain sophistic triads of propositions in which difficulties of the same type have become manifest," unquote. So he's saying that there's no tradition of history, of an inquiry into history, better. But so he's going to, instead of taking that straight on, he's going to raise some questions. And just quoting again, quote, "These are the 3 propositions. 1, history, it seems, does not exist. All conduct of man that supposedly weaves the fabric of history can be adequately understood in terms of sociology and psychology. 2, there is drama in history, but it is unfinished and its meaning is therefore unknowable. 3, there are facts of history. They even can be reasonably well ascertained with regard to phenomenal aspects, but their selection and interpretation is subjective and therefore reflects no more than the historiographer's value judgments," unquote. In these, he goes on to discuss in this essay how he is basically riffing off of Gorgias and other ancient sophists who would say things like, nothing exists. Even if it does exist, we couldn't know it. And even if we could know it, we couldn't speak about it. And so he is bringing this perspective to history. So he's essentially implying that history, the state of development of history as a theoretical discipline, is at the state of knowledge at the time of the ancient sophists. And he is, in doing so, in asking these questions in this very sophistical vein, giving us a via negativa to history, that is to say, the negative way. He's telling us what history is not. And he does this again after a fashion in volume 4 of his Order and History series. This was originally published in 1974, and the title of the volume is The Ecumenic Age. So again, quote, "The introduction has introduced itself as the form that a philosophy of history has to assume in the present historical situation. And this form is definitely not a story of meaningful events to be arranged on a timeline. In this new form, the analysis had to move backward and forward and sideways in order to follow empirically the patterns of meaning as they revealed themselves in the self-interpretation of persons and societies in history. It was a movement through a web of meaning with a plurality of nodal points. Still, certain dominant lines of meaning become visible while moving through the web. There was the fundamental advance from compact to differentiated consciousness and this distribution over a plurality of ethnic cultures. There were the lines of pneumatic and noetic differentiation distributed over Israel and Hellas. There was the outburst of ecumenic imperial conquest that forced the former ethnic cultures into a new ecumenic society. There were the reactions of the ethnic cultures to the imperial conquest, with the lines of differentiation developing lines of protective deformation. And there was the imperial conquest itself as a carrier of a meaning of humanity beyond the tribal and ethnic level. From the ecumenic age, there emerges a new type of ecumenic humanity, which, with all its complications of meaning, reaches as a millennial constant into the modern Western civilization," unquote. So what is the ecumenic age that he is talking about? Well, it's simply a periodization. Here from the same volume, quote, "The ecumenic age will denote a period in history of mankind that roughly extends from the rise of the Persian Empire to the fall of the Roman Empire. Since the concept is not established in contemporary science, the study must begin with an exposition of the epochal events that made its creation necessary, that is, the fall of Israel and Hellas to the power of empire. That is to say, the Jews and Greeks were conquered by the Romans." And he says in this passage here that the concept is not established. In other words, this isn't a periodization that other people use, but it's going to be the periodization that's going to be significant to the way he is going to tell history and formulate his philosophy of history. I found in several places that Voegelin uses the interesting descriptive phrase cosmological civilization. So here's one example from the same Order and History, Volume 4, The Ecumenic Age. Quote, "In a cosmological civilization, as for instance the Indian, metempsychosis became the Buddhist solution to the problem of how the ecumeny of the presently living was related to past and future mankind," unquote. Metempsychosis is simply the transmigration of the soul. So he's talking about a particular kind of civilization. So I looked a little further to find out where this fits in the overall scheme, and I found a passage that it's pretty clear about that. In his 1962 essay, so a dozen years before this Volume 4 of Order and History, he wrote a paper called World Empire and the Unity of Mankind. And here we find the following, which puts the cosmological civilizations in their context. He uses empire and civilization virtually interchangeably. So in this passage, he speaks in terms of empires, but in other books and in other papers, he speaks in terms of civilization. So, quote, "The attempts at representing mankind through imperial organizations have a long history beginning with the Mesopotamian and Egyptian establishments. Confining the enumeration to the types that belong to the past, one can distinguish within this history the cosmological, the ecumenic, and the orthodox empires. While they all intend to incorporate the universal order of human existence in the particular order of a finite society, they are more than individuals of the species world empire. For the types do not follow one another at random. They form a meaningful sequence, each presupposing the preceding one, so that the sequence becomes an irreversible whole of experiments with the problem of order. The first type is still compact, incorporating the universal order by means of the myth of the cosmos. The problems that become troublesome later have not yet emerged. The second type gains a differentiated experience of the truth of human existence, while imperial order develops a tendency to become ecumenically expansive. The two diverging movements that would result in the loss of the world for the empire are brought together by the tentative associations between the imperial order and representative humanity. In the Orthodox empires, finally, this association is understood as a necessity and becomes stabilized over long periods. So far, the sequence makes sense, and the sense is irreversible, unquote. So Voegelin is setting up a sequence of kinds of civilization where cosmological civilization is followed by ecumenic civilization is followed by Orthodox civilization. Now, in coming across this, you may wonder at, from the earlier quote I gave, that history is definitely not a story of meaningful events to be arranged in a timeline. Here he seems to be saying that that there is a definite timeline and order. In what he says in this previous passage I just read, clearly sounds like cultural evolutionism applied on the civilizational level. I'm sure a Voegelin scholar could disambiguate this. I certainly don't know enough about Voegelin to know what exactly how he squares that circle of suggesting that history is much more than just a series of meaningful events, and here's giving us a very clear example of a series of meaningful structures in history. But as I said, starting out, Voegelin can be quite difficult to read and difficult to understand. You have to know his references. You have to be aware of the same literature that he has read to know what he's talking about. But he can also be very lucid and very clear. He had a reputation among his students of being able to explain any idea with perfect clarity at any time. But his paper on Toynbee is I found to be quite clear. So his 1961 paper on Toynbee is titled Toynbee's History as a Search for Truth. And it's much more sympathetic than I would have expected from Voegelin. And in the Voegelin quote I just wrote, where he talks about sequences of kinds of civilizations, we can see immediately how similar that is to Toynbee's project. So here's a quote from Voegelin's essay on Toynbee that's a real tribute to Toynbee and his work. Quote, "One cannot but be moved when reading these pages. A giant work has been completed. The societies whose courses are the concern of history, according to the programmatic definition, have been successfully explored. And the result is the insight that the wheels of civilization carry a vehicle that is not itself a civilization toward its goal. The whole labor would be wasted unless the study of history be expanded to the independent entities with a claim to be studied on their own merits, because they, and not the civilizations, hold the key to the meaning of history. In the metaphors of these pages, Toynbee has achieved a new insight in the cognitive sense, because he has reached a new stage in his Zetima in the existential sense. For this is the crossroads at which he could have taken the way of Spengler into the tragic experience of civilizations as a spiritually unrelieved organic rhythm of birth and death, of growth and decay. When in universal states and churches lie recognized something more than byproducts of a disintegrating civilization, he is informed by a sensitiveness for the presence of the spirit in history that is so significant, so signally absent in Spengler," unquote. So what is Zetima that he uses in this passage? That just means a search for meaning in history. So Toynbee's search for meaning in history has revealed these things and shown him, in Voegelin's view, to be to see what Spengler has missed, to see more than Spengler has seen. And yet near the end of this essay, despite how surprisingly sympathetic and appreciative he is of Toynbee, he gives another assessment that is quite striking and is very helpful to us to understand where Voegelin is at. Quote, "At this point, the debate must cease. For here we are facing, on the part of Toynbee, a dilettantism with regard to questions of reason and revelation, philosophy and religion, metaphysics and theology, intuition and science, as well as communication, that could easily be overcome by anybody who wanted to overcome it. The situation on the level of overt argument points to the more deeply seated difficulty that Toynbee is sensitive to the word of God insofar as he has become historically tangible in the dogmatic symbols and ecclesiastic institutions, but that he does not hear the word as spoken to him personally, unquote. So this is really fascinating to see Voegelin call Toynbee a dilettante, because the charge of dilettantism has been levied against Toynbee on many occasions, but there's always his dilettantism in history itself. Professional historians generally have a very low opinion of Toynbee. So Voegelin is saying that Toynbee is a dilettante in philosophical, religious, and theological thought, and he's unwilling to take this extra step, or perhaps he's unable, because Voegelin is saying that he does not hear the word of God spoken to him personally, as it were, where presumably this has happened for Voegelin, so he gets it and Toynbee didn't. Most philosophers of history, certainly not all, have criticized Toynbee for being too religious. Walter Kaufmann in particular, I cite him because I'm familiar with his work, has a couple essays in which he really hammers Toynbee for his constantly throwing in religious references, and many have criticized his work for being too philosophical and too metaphysical. But this is actually very helpful for us to understand Voegelin. So if mainstream historians are here in the center, then off to one side, then we have Toynbee, who's too philosophical for them. And then far beyond Toynbee, there's Voegelin, for whom Toynbee is not philosophical enough. So that gives us some sense of Voegelin's position in regard to other philosophers of history, philosophies of history, and the historian's point of view. So with all this religious interest, and you can, in all of Voegelin's text, you can find this deep presence of religious ideas, both from ancient all the way to the present. It's not surprising that his best known work is on Gnosticism. His essay, Science, Politics, and Gnosticism, is his best known work, and is written in a semi-popular vein. Is certainly more accessible than most of his other work that I have perused so far. And it raises the question whether there can be a modern Gnosticism. Many people have criticized Voegelin for his use of Gnosticism, for taking it out of its historic context, which is exactly what I was talking about yesterday in regard to Gilbert Murray's failure of nerve thesis. Is the failure of nerve something very specific only to late antiquity? And for that matter, is Gnosticism something that's only significant for late antiquity, and it doesn't make much sense to take it out of that? So can we formulate a concept of Gnosticism that is applicable to other periods of time and not just late antiquity? And Voegelin does at least give a definition of this reasonably clear of Gnosticism. Quote, all Gnostic movements are involved in the project of abolishing the constitution of being with its origin in divine transcendent being, and replacing it with a world immanent order of being, the perfection of which lies in the realm of human action. This is a matter of so altering the structure of the world, which is perceived as inadequate, that a new satisfying world arises. The variants of immanentization, therefore, are the controlling symbols to which the other complexes are subordinated as secondary ways of expressing the will to immanentization, unquote. So twice he uses in this passage the idea of immanentization. And if you only heard one thing about Voegelin, the thing you would have heard is the phrase, don't immanentize the eschaton. This was actually picked up by William F. Buckley, and it became something of a slogan at the time of when he was current and had his television show. So what does that mean, don't immanentize the eschaton? Eschaton is the root for the word in English. It's a Greek word with its root. It is root for eschatology. eschatology is the religious doctrine of last things. Now, that could mean last things for the individual person, that is to say, life after death, or it can be last things for the human species as a whole. In other words, human destiny, usually conceived in a religious context, but the word has come into wider use. So there are people who study the end of the universe and call that cosmological eschatology. So don't immanentize the eschaton essentially means don't try to create heaven on earth, that these are two distinct orders. But at the same time, my impression of Voegelin's view of history is that it is essentially a struggle against immanentization. And the theme of transcendence runs throughout his works. But I'm not going to go into that right now. That's another subject. So happy birthday, Erich Voegelin, and thanks for listening.